You mentioned that how much new material is coming out, and most of it is accurate, but some of it really isn't, and it's kind of sad. There's so many people that have so many different ideas, and trying to keep it all straight is not an easy task. There's so much, I guess the technical term would be BS. Where to begin? The fairy tale that the Zapruder film is faked, the idea that the driver turned around and shot the president, thought that Oswald was in the doorway of the depository, things like that. And it creates a tremendous need to waste time to try to correct that, to keep everything as accurate as possible. It's bad enough having to deal with the garbage that the government has put out, but so many people on our side have fallen for some of this fairy tale business. It's a difficult thing to have to deal with, wasting so much time, so much energy, so much money, trying to set the record straight on those things.
Well, we don't have to go into that because sometimes it's a gray area and people are arguing over a photograph.
We caught a clip here. Now, this is not the first time we tried to get Robert Groden to debate you, and we've come up empty-handed so far. It's been almost a year now that we've been calling out to Robert Groden to say anything besides it's all BS and those crazy researchers don't know what they're talking about. Well, okay, I hear you. Show me something, but you will never show us anything. So can you comment on this? And also the cheap shot of putting you in with a limo driver shooting him.
So, Gary, it's embarrassing that Robert Groden makes these casual throwaway lines. It's obviously his excuse for evading the whole issue. He won't deal with the facts. He won't deal with the evidence. I've demonstrated repeatedly that the Zapruder film was altered. We've just had a reaffirmation of it here. I published an article entitled The JFK War, the challenging case of Robert Groden, where I address both the question of the authenticity of the film and enumerate 7 or 8 different lines of attack, including that we have multiple researchers who have actually seen what appears to be the unedited film. And, of course, we have the gigantic problem of the limousine having been brought to a halt, which has been reaffirmed now by the motorcycle escort officers, and which means, since it's not seen in the video, that obviously in the film, that obviously the film has been altered. It's embarrassing that Robert Groden pretends to be an expert on the assassination while maintaining these absurdities, and for him to toss in, suggest it's a fairy tale that the Zapruder film is not authentic, just as it's a fairy tale that William Greer shot JFK, and just as it's a fairy tale that Lee Oswald was in the doorway. That has also been proven time and time again. Most recently, I did an exchange with a conspiracy critic about the Oswald Innocence Campaign, where I laid out the case for Oswald in the doorway, which is also, by the way, dealt with in my article, The JFK War, the challenging case of Robert Groden. So if Groden wants to fold his tent and silently steal away and think he can accomplish some kind of victory by means of a smear, a throwaway line, that's completely unacceptable. I hereby challenge him once again to come on with me. It could either be on my own show, or it could be on a show that you moderate, or it could be on Black Op Radio, where he's committing these verbal atrocities, and let Len Osanic moderate the show. But Groden has to show up. He can't win by a casual throwaway. An assertion that I am wrong is not an argument. It does not constitute proof. We have to deal with evidence, or Robert Groden is going to stand condemned as a weakling and a coward when it comes to defending his position on the 2 crucial questions of the assassination, namely whether the film is or is not authentic, and whether Oswald was or was not in the doorway, as captured by the famous photograph taken by James Ike Alton.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, we're way behind on the 50 reasons for 50 years. We've got to make up, so we're going to dedicate the whole show to knocking out these Black Op episodes, and we're going to be on to other things very soon.
Early in the Warren Commission's life, they had to respond to persistent rumors coming out of Texas that Lee Oswald was an FBI informant and that he may have been an agent of the intelligence community. The Commission's lead counsel, J. Lee Rankin, had to deal with these issues in a series of meetings and executive sessions in January 1964. The fact that J. Edgar Hoover had proclaimed on November 24th that they had the assassin, if the commissioners were to pursue information discovered about Lee Oswald, it would lead to a confrontation between the Commission and the FBI. Author Gerold McKnight, in his book, Breach of Trust, has gone into great detail with these often overlooked executive sessions, which reveal just how the commissioners had to rationalize not digging any deeper into the facts.
The guys on the commission were kind of confused about what Oswald's motive was. I mean, they did have to learn something. All of these sessions were top-secret sessions. I know in the January 27th transcript, Rankin brought up the fact that Oswald had spent some time at the U.S. Military Language School in Monterey. You didn't just send Marines, just pick them out of line and say, okay, we're sick of looking at you here in South Carolina or whatever, and throw them into a program like the Military Language School out in California. Those are crash courses. I mean, that's serious business. They recognized he had a talent. Oswald was a low-functioning agent of the American government. He was part of what was called the False Defector Program, which was a joint program run by the Office of Naval Intelligence and the CIA. When Oswald got to Russia and he met with Marina, she said, well, he had an accent that was not exactly Russian language, but it sounded like he may have been from Lithuania or Latvia. So his command of Russian was pretty damn good. The men he worked with in Russia at the radio factory, I think he spoke largely in English, but he knew Russian so he could listen to them. What is he going to get? Some low-level kind of intelligence? I don't know. Oswald was a government agent. There's no question about that. That's just 2.5 years in Russia. He comes back to this country. They pay his fare back for him and Marina and Nick Child. I think from the very get-go, Rankin knew what his obligations were. His obligations were simply to close this thing down. There was some indication, was believed, or it was brooded about, that Oswald may have been an FBI informant. He could have easily have been Hosty's man. You know, James Hosty, he was Dallas FBI, but that he wasn't on the books. That is, he wasn't being paid. Or if he was being paid without any kind of paper record. There was the district attorney, Wade, when he was there they were at the meeting at the 24th, was he and a few others from Dallas. Rankin was there, and I think Warren was there. The only thing we know about 22nd, certainly the 24th meeting, is what Rankin tells us. There is no written record of what took place on the 24th. Wade, he made the case that, he said, I was, probably the head FBI guy in Ecuador. He said, I hired sources, paid them money, but I never had their names on book. I didn't copy them down at all, but they were my assets. If Oswald was anything, it's like Jack Ruby, who was, in fact, a provisional criminal informant. Now, that isn't so surprising because Ruby was running strip joints and bars and things like that, so he is the kind of person that the FBI would have sidled up to and say, look, you want to be welcomed here in the city and you want to be part of good government. Now, in New Orleans, maybe we got a case here. He's running Fair Play for Cuba. He gets in trouble. Oswald was turning out Fair Play for Cuba stuff, I think, and Bringuer and a couple of others took exception to that, and the cops come in. And so he ends up in jail. And then he calls FBI office in New Orleans, right? And he says, I'm in jail down here. And so what happens? Another FBI agent from the New Orleans office shows up at the jail and sits down, and they have this long colloquy. It's a couple of hours. They go on. And one has to ask you, what is this? Something's going on there. There's some connection there. And that whole 27th is how are we going to handle Hoover and at the same time maintain something by way of our cosmetic independence. If you have never read Breach of Trust, there is a 4-page document in the appendix. It is an FBI damage control tickler file, and it reveals what came to be known as the Hoover horrors. It reveals an assortment of improper acts, blackmail threats, and copious examples of FBI failures to conduct any semblance of a good faith investigation. The only reason we know about this document was that it was mistakenly released to a Washington, D.C. lawyer under a Freedom of Information request. On the 23rd, 10 o'clock in the morning, Hoover calls Johnson and says, look, we've been looking at the evidence, and over 500 items came up with Agent Drain. They had a military plane. They got it up there 6 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd, and the FBI forensic boys were poring all over this. It's a quick review of the evidence, forensic evidence. They don't have a case. Hoover told President Johnson that the case against Oswald was, quote, not very, very strong, unquote. On 11/24, after Oswald's assassination, Hoover, in a memo to President aide Walter Jenkins, asserted that Oswald was the sole killer, and the Bureau must convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin. What a difference a day makes. Did the FBI lab come up with solid physical evidence tying Oswald unquestionably to the shooting in one day? No, not at all. I'm confident that the FBI never came up with any evidence that met forensic standards determining that Oswald was JFK's killer. On the contrary, I have seen a lot of inside FBI documents that FBI agents admitted that Oswald never shot anyone. Now, what changes that is the 24th. Oswald is dead. There'll be no trial. The evidence is not going to be trotted out here in any significant, serious form. Oswald has no lawyers. Case closed. But here's Kennedy, elected by the people and then removed from office by assassination, by an internal coup. This is the beginning of the decline of the United States. And here we are now. I mean, the decline is perceptible now, and you can almost hear it.
So in January 1964, the Warren Commission had to decide whether to pursue the truth wherever it may lead, or to work out a report compromised by the political realities of the time. The fact is, the Commission did compromise, and by doing so, the fix was in.
Well, I think this is generally a very, very good episode. I particularly like that he identified that Oswald was at the Monterey Language School run by the military. That would have been in 1958. I frequently observe that it's a standing order in the Marine Corps that every Marine from the highest-ranking general to the lowest-ranking private must qualify with a rifle every year. He qualified as a recruit in 1957 with a .212, which is a reasonable shooting. I qualified with a .212 myself, but in 1958 he didn't make an appearance on the range. In 1959 he barely qualified with a .191, having dropped 21 points, which made him a mediocre shot, even under a charitable description. So my inference has been that he was at the Monterey Language School in 1958 studying Russian, and I think that has been, he's confirming that here, Gerold McKnight, which is good. I think he's mistaken about the Oswald not having been paid for his work as an informant for the FBI. In fact, Wagner Carr, the Attorney General of Texas, launched his own investigation immediately after the assassination, discovered he was working as an informant for the FBI, had informant number 179, was being paid $200 right up to the time of the assassination, which explains the very peculiar situation that the government insists it's unable to produce the W-2 forms for the alleged assassin of our 35th president, no doubt because it would have revealed those payments. So he appears to have been recruited by the ONI as a recruit in the Marine Corps to evade his pseudo-defection to Russia at the behest of the CIA, and then been working for the FBI in New Orleans and in Dallas after the assassination, where he was set up to play the role of the patsy. And I like also the observation that the United States has been on the decline since the assassination of JFK. I think there's no doubt about it that it's virtually measurable. And at this point in time, I think the status of the United States as a great power is on the wane. The country is disintegrating internally and with respect to its relations with other nations.
Yes, sir. From that day, we've gone from Kennedy telling Israel you're not getting any nuclear weapons to 80% dual citizenship in our Congress and Senate, or at least shields thereof. So, all right, Dr. Fetzer, let's go on to the next one, 34.
Shots have just rang out in Dealey Plaza. An alert policeman in the motorcade stops his motorcycle and runs up to the source of the shots with his revolver drawn. Police come across the suspect, but this man holds up Secret Service identification, then disappears into the crowd that had assembled, all searching for the shooters. The Warren Commission revealed this did happen as a fact with Officer Joseph Smith's testimony, but then goes on to say there was no Secret Service on the grassy knoll and leave it as a mystery. Longtime critic of the Warren Commission, author and lawyer Mark Lane, in his new book, goes into the details of just who was in charge of Secret Service credentials and identification for presidential protection. In 1963, it was the CIA, and the Warren Commission didn't want anyone to discover that fact.
This is Mark Lane. I'm a defense lawyer. I've been a defense lawyer for 60 years. And so the first thing I saw when I saw the Kennedy assassination, saw Oswald, was, did he do it? How would I defend him, etc.? And so Rush to Judgment, my first book on the subject, really dealt with that question, and I've been dealing with that for many years. More recently, I said, I want to look at this from a different perspective, and that is, what did the assassin or assassins, what were their problems? I want to look at it from their viewpoint just to see how they would overcome difficulties. Well, in my view, and I've written about it and talked about it, the CIA was involved in killing President Kennedy. I accept that as the starting point. What would the CIA have to do to kill the president? The first thing is, he's protected by the Secret Service. So how do we deal with them? Well, first of all, the CIA provided all of the credentials for every member of the Secret Service. So they knew where each person was. Whether they worked for the CIA at that point, we don't know, but we do know that the CIA knew where they were because they provided credentials. And when the guy came from behind the wooden fence after the assassination and was stopped by a Dallas police officer, he held up his credentials to show, because the Dallas police officer, Smith, thought that he had caught the assassin, and I think he had, one of them, because the shots came from there, and the guy held up credentials from the United States Secret Service. Nobody knew at that time that those credentials had been prepared and issued by the CIA, the same group that killed the president. The other members of the Secret Service, let's take a look at them. William R. Greer was driving the car. To his right was R.H. Kellerman. And what was his job? He's practiced this many times. When the first sound you hear, even if you think it's a firecracker, step on the accelerator and get out of there. In fact, he testified that our car's specially built. You step on the gas, it's like you're leaping to another planet. You just roar right out of there. After the first shot was fired, he slowed down. How slowly did he go? Clint Hill was in a follow-up car. Now, Clint Hill was not part of the Kennedy detail, so he never got the memo about what we're doing that day. Clint Hill was there because he was supporting and protecting Jacqueline Kennedy, had done for years. Wherever she went to Europe, he was with her. That was his assignment, Jacqueline Kennedy. He was not part of the John Kennedy detail. When he heard the first shot, he jumped off the follow-up car, which was supposed to be speeding away, and they testified before the Warren Commission that they were speeding away. Clint Hill was wearing leather soles, and he ran and reached the car. How fast was the car going? Well, it was going 15 miles an hour, then Clint Hill's a world-class sprinter while wearing leather-soled shoes. So that's how it begins. How did Hill catch the speeding limousine? We're going to hear now about the magic sprinter theory. And why did Kellerman, who was to the right of the driver of the limousine, not seek to cover Kennedy's body with his own, which was his only job, in the passenger seat, front passenger seat? That was his only assignment. He never moved. Didn't seem surprised when he heard, you'd see there's a bit of him, and you read the testimony. Didn't even seem surprised when he heard the shot. And what about this other 6 Secret Service agents in the follow-up car? With the exception of Hill, who was not assigned to protect the president, they did nothing. Hill never got a memo because he wasn't assigned to John Kennedy. After the Kennedy assassination, the phrase credibility gap became a prominent phrase in America. And it merely means, it's a polite way of saying, we believe the government's lying to us. There's a credibility gap between what the government says and what we believe. Well, when the Warren Commission was appointed, J. Lee Rankin, the general counsel of the Warren Commission, was interviewed by the New York Times. And they asked him what his assignment was, and he said to reassure the American people that all is well. That was the whole story, because that was the role of the Warren Commission. Our job was to reassure the American people. But it wasn't their job. Their job was to tell the American people the truth. See, I believe the American people can deal with the truth. I believe people everywhere in the world can deal with the truth. What they cannot deal with is their government lying to them.
Well, this is a generally good episode with a couple of caveats. One is that we know the source of the Secret Service false IDs. They were prepared by Chauncey Marvin Holt, who was then working as a contract agent for the CIA, where he was instructed by his handler, Philip Twombly, while working at the Los Angeles Stamp and Stationery Store to prepare 15 sets of forged Secret Service credentials and the identifying pins they wore that day. He took them to Dealey Plaza and was supposed to leave them in a red pickup truck parked behind the Grassy Knoll, which is a parking lot used by the Dallas Police Department. It wasn't there initially. He wandered around Dealey Plaza and told me he saw more bad guys, assassins, and hitmen than you'd find at a Soldiers of Fortune convention. But when he returned, it was there, and he left them, so that what was, observed by the assassin behind the picket fence was one of Chauncey's prepared forged credentials. He was the third of the three secret tramps escorted through Dealey Plaza, who were respectively Charles Rogers, whom Chauncey knew as Richard Montoya, Charles Harrelson, the father of Woody, and Chauncey Marvin Holt. I got to know Chauncey personally, by the way. I've read his book manuscripts, reviewed his case, listened to his videotape series for his daughter Karen, the whole batch. He was the real deal. And my confirmation of this was independently verified by Lois Gibson, the celebrated forensic artist for the Houston Police Department, which is also discussed in The Man on the Grassy Knoll about Charles Rogers. Now, he's also wrong in thinking that no one else responded. John Reddy on the right running board actually rushed forward, but was called back by Emory Roberts, who was in charge of the presidential detail, who also left 2 agents behind at Love Field and appears to have played a pivotal role in setting JFK up for the assassination. In addition, he's wrong about the limo. It clearly stopped, and we have the latest confirmation coming from the motorcycle escort officers themselves. If you'll check out the article I have recently published with Larry Rivera entitled "The 4 JFK Escort Officers Speak," the Fred Newcomb interviews, you'll find that one of them, actually Bobby Hargis, as I recall, walked between the 2 limousines during the stop, which of course would have been impossible had the limos not stopped. This ridiculous charade of trying to deny that the Zapruder film has been altered and that the limousines did not stop has been a major obstacle. Where it's completely disgusting to me that we have figures like Josiah Thompson, who doesn't surprise me in this regard, but also Robert Groden, who are just trashing their legacy and contributions to JFK research by perpetrating myths, fabrications about the absence of a limo stop and that the Zapruder film is authentic. This is completely disgusting and tarnishes them forever.
Welcome back to Patriot Radio New Orleans as we continue Jim Garrison's investigation. We are on the trail of the assassins. All right, we got a little controversy here between researchers, so we're going to do the hard work and settle it for you. Was the limo a high-performance vehicle or a big lumbering tub? Here's Walt Brown.
And then the car, of course, weighed 7,900 pounds and had 1,000 pounds of people in it. It's not going to do a runway takeoff like an airplane.
And Mark Lane?
He testified that our car is specially built. You step on the gas, it's like you're leaping to another planet. You just roar right out of there.
And Jim Fetzer.
Oh, it's clear that Mark Lane is correct and Walt Brown is wrong. In fact, it's embarrassing to me that Walt Brown would make such an argument. That was a very high-performance automobile. And the very idea that, Clint Hill would have been able to run up and get on the back if it had taken off is completely ridiculous. It was only because the car was motionless, it was actually stopped for what I estimate now to have been perhaps as long as 14 seconds that enabled him to get on the back of the limo. And it's fascinating that we have this kind of conflict, but there's no doubt about who's right in this matter and who is not.
Yeah, I just can't imagine with all the money to spend in the world that they wouldn't have a high-powered limo for the president. I mean, come on.
Oh, yeah.
All right, back to our job at hand. We're going to take on Cyril Wecht and the magic bullet.
Researchers and students of the assassination are familiar with the term magic bullet. This is Commission Exhibit 399, CE399. This bullet is in such pristine condition, only a fool or an apologist for the Warren Commission would try to convince anyone that CE399 hit anything. Take a good look at the bullet and evidence, and then compare that to the damage done. Look at the wounds. Look at the x-rays. The Warren Commission has more lead and evidence recovered from Governor Conley than is missing from Commission Exhibit 399. Normally, you would say, that doesn't make sense. Well, let's get a professional perspective. Respected forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht explains why CE399 is called magic.
This is Dr. Cyril H. Wecht, forensic pathologist. The single bullet theory is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report. The single bullet theory has one bullet going into Kennedy's back, exiting from the front of his neck, re-entering John Conley's back, exiting from the front of his chest, re-entering the back of John Conley's right wrist, exiting from the front of the right wrist, re-entering the left thigh, and falling out spontaneously from the left thigh, and winding up as the stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, that was fortuitously found. This bullet, in its store-bought condition, weighs 161 grains. As it was found, it weighed 158.6 grains, a loss of 2.4 grains, which is exactly 1.5% of the original mass, the weight of the bullet. And yet we have fragments found in 4 anatomic locations. I myself spoke personally with Audrey Bell, the head nurse at Parkland Hospital, who was there with the operations that were performed on Conley. She turned over 3 or 4 pieces of metal to the FBI. There's no way in the world that you can have a bullet that leaves pieces of itself in these anatomic locations and loses only 1.5% of its original weight. The condition of the bullet, this bullet which broke Conley's right fifth rib, destroying 4 inches of the bone, which produced a comminuted fracture of the distal end of the radius, one of the 2 large bones from the elbow to the wrist, and a very big solid bone, and a 6'4" heavy bone guy like John Conley. And yet we have that bullet emerging in pristine condition, no indentation of any kind other than its base, and that's from the impact of the firing mechanism. The nose, the cone of the bullet remain completely in place. And then the trajectory, the bullet hits Kennedy and is moving from, according to the Warren Commission, back to front, from right to left, and from up downward. It emerges then from Kennedy's anterior midline of the neck. Somehow it manages to swing over 18 to 20 inches to the right, hits Conley behind the right armpit, not the left shoulder, and it then proceeded downward through his chest at an angle of about 22 degrees or so, emerged below the level of the nipple in a downward trajectory. Go back to the Zapruder film, look when he is struck, and you'll see him waving his white Texas Stetson hat, and it is above the level of the nipple by far. It is at shoulder level. So that bullet emerging from his chest comes upward, swings around, smashes into the back of his wrist, exits from the wrist, and then continues downward at a 45-degree angle into the left thigh. And a bullet that penetrates into soft tissues does not just work its way out.
This is being taken care of. The bullet is in the leg. It hasn't been removed. This is a very insignificant factor.
That's the single bullet theory, and it is the most absurd piece of nonsense. It would have been presented in the courtroom, would have been destroyed.
I did not hear the second shot, the one that hit me. I understand there's some question in the minds of the experts about whether or not we could both have been hit with the same bullet, and that was the first bullet. I just don't happen to believe that. I don't believe it, and I will believe it. Again, I heard the first shot. I recognized it for what I thought it was. I had time to turn to try to see what had happened. I was in the process of turning again before I felt the impact of a bullet. Now, obviously, if the bullet that hit me before I could hear it, I was never conscious of the sound of the second bullet at all. I never heard the second bullet.
It should be noted that efforts were made to duplicate the accomplishments of Commission Exhibit 399. And one of my favorite slides, the most favorite slide that I have in my collection, shows the bullets lined up, the bullets that they fired into cotton wadding, striking nothing, and then bullets fired through goat carcasses, breaking one rib in order to simulate Conley's rib fracture, and bullets fired through human cadavers to simulate Conley's wrist fracture. They picked the bullets that had the least amount of damage. They could not come up with a bullet that came anywhere near the pristine, intact condition of that bullet. Other efforts were made by Army ballistics people and others in order to try to replicate accomplishments that are attributed to the magic bullet, and they failed. The Dr. Vincent Gwynn was called in supposedly to show that the fragment that was recovered came from 399 to the exclusion of every other bullet in the world. That has now been shown and scientifically proven and accepted by the omnipotent FBI that this is false, that you cannot make such a determination, that you cannot say that this fragment came from that particular bullet to the exclusion of all other bullets and so on. All the efforts and all the attempts to retroactively justify, substantiate, corroborate the basis for the single bullet theory have proven to be inadequate and scientifically untenable.
So there you have it. Governor Connolly's surgeon, Dr. Robert Shaw, states at 4:45 p.m., the bullet, not a fragment, the bullet is still in the governor's leg. So how can it be found on a stretcher by Daryl Tomlinson, who, by the way, said it had no blood or tissue on it at all? And that stretcher was for a boy with a broken arm. That's why they call it magic.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, some of the most basic information in the JFK case. We got Cyril Wecht in Commission Exhibit 399. What's your take?
Well, there's a whole lot more that could have been said here. For example, we have the shirt and the jacket he was wearing at the time. They both show a hole about 5.5 inches below the collar, just to the right of the spinal column, where the hole in the shirt is slightly lower than the hole in the jacket. We have the autopsy diagram drawn by J. Thornton Boswell that shows a hole, a wound in the body, the location corresponding to the shirt and the jacket, which were in violation of autopsy protocol left behind at Bethesda Naval Hospital. We have the FBI sketch by Sirbert that shows the wound to the back lower than the wound to the neck. We have the President's personal physician's death certificate locating the wound to the back at the level of T3, which is the same as the hole in the shirt, the jacket, the diagram, and so forth. We have the mortician's description of the wound as in the back is between 5 and 6 inches below the collar. We have reenactment photographs showing a stand-in for JFK with a large patch on the back to simulate the back wound, which is about the same location. And in the photographs, which you couldn't see very well here, Orland Spector holding a pointer to show the trajectory the magic bullet would have had to have taken. Were that hypothesis true, from another angle, you can see that the patch is well below his hand, which means that a photograph intended to illustrate the magic bullet theory actually refutes it. David Mandick took a patient with similar chest and neck dimensions, created a CAT scan, and plotted the official trajectory only to discover it's not even anatomically possible because cervical vertebrae intervene. And of course, in the very first releases from the ARRB was one relating that Gerald Ford had the description of the wound changed from his uppermost back to the base of the back of the neck to make the magic bullet theory more plausible, where the uppermost back was already an exaggeration. So there's a whole lot more to it. I presented all of this at Cambridge at an international conference and published it in a peer-reviewed international journal everyone can find online under the heading Reasoning About Assassinations. So if you complement what Cyril said there with what I have presented in that article, you have a very comprehensive explanation applied when Michael Baden said that if the magic bullet theory were false, then it had to have been at least 6 shots from 3 different directions.
Episode 38, Jessie Ventura.
In this week's episode, we discuss Commission Exhibit 139. It's a rifle, model 91/38, Mannlicher Carcano. The Carcano designer was Italian, Salvatore Carcano. Stamped on it, made in Italy. Caliber 6.5, serial number C2766. The Mannlicher Carcano was jokingly called the humanitarian rifle by the Italian army. It earned that nickname because they couldn't kill anyone with it. The cheap scope added by Klein Sporting Goods was awful. The doctored backyard photographs of Lee Oswald with the rifle shows that it had a bottom sling mount. The rifle found in the depository did not. As well, when he was questioned by the Dallas police, Lee told them he didn't own a rifle. The House Select Committee on Assassination's firearms panel test-fired the rifle and could not match its bullets with either CE399, the magic bullet, or test bullets fired by the FBI from what was allegedly the same rifle, Commission Exhibit 139. That's from Volume 1, page 464 of the House Select Committee hearings. What more do you need? Numerous witnesses to the shooting heard gunshots that were spaced so closely and sounded different from each other that it is not possible that all the shooting could have been done by a bolt-action rifle. Reporters on the scene wrote of hearing automatic weapons fire. An unknown rifle with no scope, no sling, and considerably longer barrel than a Mannlicher Carcano was filmed being taken from the roof of the depository. CBS News, which claimed to duplicate the conditions of the actual assassination in its filmed rifle test in 1967, did not. According to Dan Rather, 11 volunteer marksmen took turns firing clips of 3 bullets each at the moving target. They fired a total of 37 3-round series, 17 of which resulted in unfired bullets due to trouble with the rifle. Governor Jessie Ventura has held the weapon. He's looked through the scope. He's test-fired it. Here are his conclusions of the humanitarian rifle.
This is Governor Jessie Ventura, the host of Conspiracy Theory on True TV. On my TV show, I shot the weapon, the identical weapon that Lee Harvey Oswald was alleged to have used to murder our president, John F. Kennedy. In fact, the bullets that I shot that day, the rounds, even came out of the same group of rounds. They were out of the same boxes that apparently are still available today. And I can tell you this, the weapon is horrible. The telescopic sight was completely useless. It was so thin that in order to focus in on the crosshairs and the amount of time you had to get the shots off was completely impossible. All I could do was get the target in the sight, looking through the telescopic sight, and then squeeze. I couldn't do anything more than that. The other thing that made the shots impossible was working the bolt. Oswald allegedly got the shots off, 3 of them in 6 seconds or thereabouts. I believe the fastest I could work the bolt, get back on target, and get a shot off, starting with 1 shot and recycling it 2 more times. I think the fastest I could do it was the mid-8s, 8.5 seconds.
How fast?
Which is at least 2 seconds slower than allegedly that Oswald did his.
And he did it in 6? Bullshit.
So I don't believe that at all, because when I tried to do it for speed, I wasn't even caring how accurate I was shooting. I was simply trying to recycle the bolt fast enough to equal the speed which they said Lee Harvey Oswald did it. And I couldn't do it at all.
This is impossible.
I mean, I could do it and pull the trigger. I still couldn't do it fast enough, and without even trying to hit the target, simply get the round off. And so in the end, in light of the telescopic sight, in light of the fact of recycling the weapon, in light of the weapon itself, there is no doubt in my mind that Lee Harvey Oswald could not have fired and used this weapon to kill President John F. Kennedy.
Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, one of the most decorated combat snipers in United States military history. Hathcock earned 93 confirmed kills in Vietnam and went on to become the senior instructor for the U.S. Marine Corps Sniper Instruction School at Quantico, Virginia. He said, "Let me tell you what we did at Quantico. We reconstructed the whole thing. The angle, the range, the moving target, the time limit, the obstacles, everything. I don't know how many times we tried, but we couldn't duplicate what the Warren Commission said Oswald did. Now, if I can't do it, how in the world could a guy who was non-qual on the rifle range do it?
Stay tuned for the next installment as we expose week after week 50 lies the Warren Commission would like you to believe.
It was a weapon mass-produced in Italy in World War II. They had multiple factories using the same serial number, so actually the serial number Len identified was not unique to that weapon. It was known as the humanitarian rifle for never harming anyone on purpose. The Jessie Ventura clip was great to include because I was there timing Jessie's use of the weapon. It was actually in far superior condition to Lee Oswald's weapon and had a properly aligned scope. Jesse is a far superior marksman. I helped set up the targets to make sure they were at the right distances and angles using bales of hay. So Jesse, during repeated replications, was firing at stationary targets with a superior weapon, and he's a superior shooter. And the best he could do was about 8.5 seconds, as I believe he recollects in this clip. The worst was about 11-something, and then he took one extra replication after three replications with 3 shots. He managed to make one hit on a target out of 9 shots. It demonstrated, just as Gunny Hathcock demonstrated, that this was preposterous shooting. Lee Oswald couldn't possibly have done it. And Len, I think, did a very workmanlike job with his segment.
Now your host, Len Osanic.
CE399, the magic bullet. The FBI told the Warren Commission that this bullet had been fired to the Italian carbine found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And according to the Warren Commission, this bullet had been discovered on a stretcher used to transport John Connally to surgery at Parkland Hospital in the wake of the shooting. Therefore, according to the Warren Commission, this bullet was solid, positive proof of Lee Oswald's guilt as the presidential assassin. But we've seen problems with the single bullet theory, problems with the rifle, problems linking the rifle to Oswald. Could it be that there are evidentiary problems with Commission Exhibit 399 as well? Yes. On March 31st, 1964, in testimony before the Warren Commission, FBI Special Agent Robert Frazier identified CE399 as the bullet delivered to him at the FBI lab on the evening of November 22nd, 1963. Frazier's initials were on the bullet, but does this establish the bullet as the one found in Dallas? No. The bullet was said to be found by Parkland Hospital orderly Daryl Tomlinson, who passed it to the chief of Parkland Security, O.P. Wright, who passed it to the Secret Service agent Richard Johnson, who carried the bullet back to Washington and passed it to his superior, Secret Service Chief James Rowley. Rowley in turn passed the bullet to FBI Special Agent Elmer Todd, who delivered it to Robert Frazier of the FBI lab. Tomlinson had given testimony to the Warren Commission in Dallas 11 days before Frazier, and although he was questioned at length about where and how he found the bullet, Tomlinson was never actually shown the bullet because Commission Exhibit 399 was not turned over to the Warren Commission until the day after Tomlinson's testimony. It was only later that the Warren Commission became concerned that the bullet should have been identified by all who handled it. In June 1964, CE399 was sent to Dallas and shown to Tomlinson and Wright at Parkland Hospital. Neither could identify it as the bullet they handled. Back in Washington, the bullet was shown to Johnson and Rowley of the Secret Service. Neither could identify it. So incredibly, the first 4 people in the chain of possession could not identify CE399 as the bullet they handled months earlier. It was left to Special Agent Elmer Todd to identify CE399, and he did so by claiming that he could recognize his initials on the bullet. But researcher John Hunt went to the National Archives in 2004 and examined the identification photographs of CE399 and discovered that Todd's initials are not on the bullet identified as CE399. The 3 existing initials are from Frazier and the 2 other FBI agents who worked with him at the FBI lab. So CE399 is a bullet which has no verifiable chain of possession from Dallas to the FBI lab in Washington the evening of November 22nd, 1963. And that's not all that researcher John Hunt discovered. The evidence envelope, which held the bullet discovered at Parkland, clearly shows that Elmer Todd of the FBI received the bullet from Chief Rowley of the Secret Service at 8:50 p.m. on the evening of November 22nd. But Robert Frazier at the FBI lab received the bullet which he identified as CE399 at 7:30 p.m., almost 90 minutes earlier. How could this be? Two memos written on November 22nd provided an important clue. The FBI's Gordon Shanklin, in a memo written on the day of the assassination, clearly describes two bullets, one which killed the president and one recovered from Governor Connolly. A second memo written by the FBI's Alan Belmont also clearly describes two bullets. Both of these are taken from the president. The memo was distributed and signed off by nearly every senior FBI official, including J. Edgar Hoover. But reference to these multiple bullets soon disappeared from the FBI's investigation, never to be referred to again. There are numerous first-day reports of bullets found at Parkland Hospital, Dealey Plaza, even at the autopsy. All that remains in the official record is one bullet with an origin that is questionable, to say the least. All we can say is the FBI never clarified the issue, and the Warren Commission simply did not want to know.
This is Patriot Radio New Orleans. We'll see you in 5 minutes. You're listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans. We are carrying on the investigation of Jim Garrison. We're on the trail of the assassins, and we're also on the trail of the disinformation specialist, and we're going to uncover another one right now.
That Madeline Brown story, there's the mistress of Lyndon Johnson who says there was a party and Lyndon Johnson appears and he says, oh, the Kennedys will never get me again or whatever. I don't believe that it even existed. And I think one of the researchers whose work I use, Jay Harrison, agrees with me. If, in Jay Harrison's papers, which I was fortunate enough to have, but with the help of Walt Brown, that Jay writes, if there was a party, the likelihood that Johnson had foreknowledge of the assassination, I think, is slim. And this woman she lies so much in her book and in her interviews that I don't have any faith in a word she said. The one true thing that she said was that she had the child of Lyndon Johnson, that they had a child together. Nothing
Can you
else.
give me an example of something that is not true that you would use to say that I can't believe these on this fact here?
You mean about the party?
About Madeline, then, because a lot of people are taking her word for that he made that comment.
Listen, Len. If you look at the guest list that she presents in her interviews for this party at Clint Murkison's house, senior's house, the guest list changes. One time she even had Herman Brown there. He was dead by then. It's a fantasy. She has Mac Wallace, who's my subject, practicing at the Dallas Gun Club every day. He was living in California at the time, and he was working for Ling Electronics. He couldn't have been in Dallas practicing at the gun club. Furthermore, he had no ability to shoot guns. He was in the Marines for 10 months. When he was sick most of the time that he was there, I got his military records. None of that is true. Sometimes she said he was at the party. Sometimes she said he wasn't at the party. And
Let me put it this way, then. Let me put it this way. Do you think that she's mistaken or making up stuff?
Making up.
Okay, fine.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, we're going to rout out these fraudulent JFK creatures if it kills us. All right, can you comment on Joan Mellon?
Yeah, it's embarrassing to me to even hear Joan Mellon address issues where she clearly is misrepresenting the facts, doesn't know the case. I had more than 100 conversations with Madeline Duncan Brown. She was actually present at the ratification meeting at the home of Clint Murkison Sr. the night before the assassination. Others present included J. Edgar Hoover. She thought perhaps the event had been in his honor. Richard Nixon, she remembered he was driven out there by a local Republican leader who worked in the same bank building where she was a young advertising executive. George Brown and Root Heavy Construction, when the Vietnam War went down, Brown and Root got the contract to dredge a new port at Cam Ranh Bay, even though Vietnam has many magnificent natural ports, and I'm quite sure it did not need one. John J. McCloy, who was our former High Commissioner to Germany, former CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank, and whom Lyndon Johnson would subsequently appoint to one of the two civilian seats on the Warren Commission, the other going to Allen Dulles, where both of them were deeply involved in the assassination. Madeline's story has been published in Texas in the Morning. It's been corroborated by Connie Kritzberg, who was a reporter for the Dallas Morning News. She and Madeline actually co-authored a book entitled Dallas Did It, about the assassination. Garrison Edward Livingston has supported her story. More significantly, Nigel Turner, who produced The Men Who Killed Kennedy, devoted his final segment, The Guilty Men, to Madeline's story. He actually produced evidence that substantiated in the form of the chauffeur who drove J. Edgar Hoover out to the event and the chef who prepared the hors d'oeuvres. I don't understand why Joan Mellon is making claims that are not only false but provably false and attempting to diminish one of the most significant witnesses we have about Lyndon Johnson and his crucial role in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I find her action here once again to be contemptible.
Mm-hmm. So do you think we have someone in the 90% working from the other side?
What is astonishing, Gary, how many, continue to insist on, the falsity of evidence that is well established, which not only includes Joan Mellon in attacking Madeline Duncan Brown, Joan Mellon in attacking Judith Berry Baker, or, Josiah Thompson attacking the lack of the authenticity of the Zapruder film, Robert Groden maintaining the authenticity of the Zapruder film, a lot of different individuals attacking the fact that Lee Oswald was found in a photograph, captured in a photograph, the most famous photograph taken in Dealey Plaza by James Ike Algins. It's really disgusting.
Do you think that she's mistaken or making up stuff?
Making up.
Okay, fine. CE399, the magic bullet. The FBI told the Warren Commission that this bullet had been fired to the Italian carbine found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And according to the Warren Commission, this bullet had been discovered on a stretcher used to transport John Connally to surgery at Parkland Hospital in the wake of the shooting. Therefore, according to the Warren Commission, this bullet was solid, positive proof of Lee Oswald's guilt as the presidential assassin. But we've seen problems with the single bullet theory, problems with the rifle, problems linking the rifle to Oswald. Could it be that there are evidentiary problems with Commission Exhibit 399 as well? Yes. On March 31st, 1964, in testimony before the Warren Commission, FBI Special Agent Robert Frazier identified CE399 as the bullet delivered to him at the FBI lab on the evening of November 22nd, 1963. Frazier's initials were on the bullet, but does this establish the bullet as the one found in Dallas? No. The bullet was said to be found by Parkland Hospital orderly Daryl Tomlinson, who passed it to the chief of Parkland Security, O.P. Wright, who passed it to the Secret Service agent Richard Johnson, who carried the bullet back to Washington and passed it to his superior, Secret Service Chief James Rowley. Rowley in turn passed the bullet to FBI Special Agent Elmer Todd, who delivered it to Robert Frazier of the FBI lab. Tomlinson had given testimony to the Warren Commission in Dallas 11 days before Frazier, and although he was questioned at length about where and how he found the bullet, Tomlinson was never actually shown the bullet because Commission Exhibit 399 was not turned over to the Warren Commission until the day after Tomlinson's testimony. It was only later that the Warren Commission became concerned that the bullet should have been identified by all who handled it. In June 1964, CE399 was sent to Dallas and shown to Tomlinson and Wright at Parkland Hospital. Neither could identify it as the bullet they handled. Back in Washington, the bullet was shown to Johnson and Rowley of the Secret Service. Neither could identify it. So incredibly, the first 4 people in the chain of possession could not identify CE399 as the bullet they handled months earlier. It was left to Special Agent Elmer Todd to identify CE399, and he did so by claiming that he could recognize his initials on the bullet. But researcher John Hunt went to the National Archives in 2004 and examined the identification photographs of CE399 and discovered that Todd's initials are not on the bullet identified as CE399. The 3 existing initials are from Frazier and the 2 other FBI agents who worked with him at the FBI lab. So CE399 is a bullet which has no verifiable chain of possession from Dallas to the FBI lab in Washington the evening of November 22nd, 1963. And that's not all that researcher John Hunt discovered. The evidence envelope, which held the bullet discovered at Parkland, clearly shows that Elmer Todd of the FBI received the bullet from Chief Rowley of the Secret Service at 8:50 p.m. on the evening of November 22nd. But Robert Frazier at the FBI lab received a bullet which he identified as CE399 at 7:30 p.m., almost 90 minutes earlier. How could this be? 2 memos written on November 22nd provided an important clue. The FBI's Gordon Shanklin, in a memo written on the day of the assassination, clearly describes 2 bullets, one which killed the president and one recovered from Governor Connolly. A second memo written by the FBI's Alan Belmont also clearly describes 2 bullets. Both of these are taken from the president. The memo was distributed and signed off by nearly every senior FBI official, including J. Edgar Hoover. But reference to these multiple bullets soon disappeared from the FBI's investigation, never to be referred to again. There are numerous first-day reports of bullets found at Parkland Hospital, Dealey Plaza, even at the autopsy. All that remains in the official record is 1 bullet with an origin that is questionable, to say the least. All we can say is the FBI never clarified the issue, and the Warren Commission simply did not want to know.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, we've got Len on episode 40 talking about CE399.
I think Len Osanic did a very fine job with this information he does not know came to my attention through the friend, now deceased driver of the Secret Service vehicle, Sam Kenny, who died in 1990, confided in his friend what I'm about to relate and asked that he not make it public until after his demise, but the friend actually waited until after the demise of his wife as well, which didn't occur until 2008. I interviewed him on The Real Deal, and you can find the interview there, but what he told me of significance that Sam Kenny had confided in him was that it was he who got the bucket and sponge and began to, at the Parkland Hospital, and began to wash the blood and brains out of the back seat because, as he put it to his friend, he didn't want the president to be remembered that way. Of course, he was in the process of destroying evidence of a crime, but that, in addition, he found a bullet on this which would have very plausibly worked its way out of the shot to the back, 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column, because it was a shallow shot that only went in about as far as the second knuckle at your little finger at a downward angle. And he said that he took the bullet into the hospital and set it on a stretcher. So that if what he is telling us is true, then that turns out to be the origin of the commission exhibit. But of course, it's not a bullet that passed through the back of JFK's neck or entered John Connolly. Indeed, we know there was no such bullet, but it may well have been the bullet that entered his back at the location I previously described, and where you can find more information about it in the article I published, Reasoning About Assassinations.
Excellent. All right, we're going to go into one more. We got episode 41. It's about the little-known executive session of the Warren Committee.
Even though the Warren Commission hedged some of its bets, such as acknowledging they never could assign a motive to their assassin, the conclusion of a single gunman being responsible for the president's death and that there was absolutely no conspiracy has always been a hallmark of the commission's shoddy work. Indeed, ever since the Warren Commission handed in its final report, the American establishment has treated any dissent from this official position as a sign of disloyalty, unworthy, and as a mark of a conspiracy theorist. Never has honest political historical research been mentioned. But a little-known fact is the first critic of the Warren Commission was on the Warren Commission itself. His critique, like so many other facts, have been covered up. Author Gerold McKnight tells the story of the first dissenter, Senator Richard Russell.
This is Gerold McKnight, the author of Breach of Trust. Russell is the first dissenter of the Warren Commission report, and he was on the Warren Commission. Russell is not like these clowns we have in the Senate today. This guy was serious business. Russell was elected to the upper house in 1933. He was a senior member of the upper chamber and respected by his colleagues on both sides of the aisle. He was even celebrated as the quote-unquote dean of the Senate by Ted Kennedy, who, of course, had different views than Russell on the civil rights question. He spent a lot of time and energy, unfortunately, in trying to prevent any kind of progress for black people in this country. I mean, he was speaking for Georgia. He's a segregationist in that sense. He was wrong. But he was able to work with the Democrats on other issues, and he was highly respected. Russell was horse-collared by President Johnson to be a member of the Warren Commission. Russell protested, but Johnson had his way by telling Russell it would not take all of his time. And even more instrumental was LBJ's tactic of dangling in front of Russell the prospect that unless the American people were satisfied that Kennedy was the victim of a lone assassin, that right-wing elements in the nation might push this country into a confrontation with the Soviet Union with the prospect of 40 million dead Americans. He used that on Russell, he used that on Warren also, who was reluctant. But once Warren got that kind of pitch, he broke into tears and said, certainly, I'll work on the commission. It should be noted that all of LBJ's choices for the commission, after each was waved under Hoover's nose for his approval, none of them, Democrats or Republicans, were supporters and were political allies of President Kennedy. Russell spent most of the life of the Warren Commission absenting himself from the work and sometimes even skipping the executive sessions. In May, FBI Director Hoover addressed the commission. He was quick to assert that there was, quote, not a scintilla of evidence showing any foreign or domestic conspiracy in the Kennedy killing, unquote. He went on in the same vein, launching a preemptive strike against any future dissenters and critics of the commission and, by extension, the FBI, the commission's investigative arm. The irony here is that little did Hoover suspect that the first dissenter of the official story was Senator Richard Russell.
Well, they were trying to prove that the same bullet that hit Kennedy first was the one that hit Connally. Went through him and through his hand, his bone, into his leg, and everything else. Just a lot of stuff there. I couldn't get all the evidence and cross-examine all of them. But I did read the record and.
Well, what difference did it make which bullet got Connally?
Well, it don't make much difference, but they said that they believe, that the commission believed that the same bullet that hit Kennedy hit Connally. Well, I don't believe it.
I don't either.
And so I couldn't sign it. And I said that Governor Connally testified directly to the contrary, and I'm not going to approve of that. So I finally made them say there was a difference in the commission in that. Part of them believed that wasn't so.
On September 18th, 1964, Senator Russell forced a special executive session of the commission. Russell explained to his commission colleagues that he could not sign a report stating that the same bullet that hit President Kennedy exited his body and went into Connally. This would be part of it we recognize essential to the single bullet theory, which was essential to the contention that there was one shooter and that shooter was Oswald. He had some reservations, and he wanted these in the record because he wanted his constituents at home who put him into office be respected in the terms that that's why they put him in office, to be a caretaker and to look after their interests. Kentucky's Republican Senator John S. Cooper was persuaded to join Russell in his dissent, and Louisiana's Hale Boggs was wavering and tilting toward also joining the dissenters and rejecting the single bullet explanation. It should be noted that Russell's rejection of the single bullet theory was part and parcel of his displeasure of the quality of the FBI investigation and the information it fed to the commission. After an exhausting morning search for some mutual solution to the impasse, John McCloy came up with language that both the majority and the Russell faction could reluctantly agree upon. Russell's contention to the single bullet theory was softened to a degree by his insistence that the report include language categorically conceding that Oswald could not have carried out the assassination on his own. While the special September session ostensibly came equipped with stenographers who were presumably recording the session for the record and for posterity, this was all a fiddle. Rankin, and it had to be with Warren's permission, had the whole thing staged, and it was nothing more than an empty performance. Russell was aware that a stenographer was in the room while the commission was in session, but the stenographers were not even bothering taking notes. They were hired by Rankin to deceive Russell. There was, in fact, no record made of the September executive session called by Russell. Harold Weisberg, I was a neighbor of his, one of the early critics of the Warren Commission, and really one of the more successful critics, learned from rumors circulating in Washington that the September 18th session was a fakery. He contacted the National Archives in Washington, D.C. for a copy of the verbatim transcript. He learned that there was no record of any session, just some quote-unquote secretarial business notes about when the commission members could expect copies of the Warren report and other innocuous tripe. When Weisberg showed Russell Archivist Rhodes' letter, Russell was aghast. This kind of suppression was outside his experience on his 40 years in Capitol Hill. He resigned his chairmanship from the Military Affairs Committee and divested himself of his oversight responsibilities on the CIA. He urged Weisberg to continue his work on the Kennedy assassination. And so we have here Russell, who emerges as the first dissenter of the Warren Commission report. He never changed his mind about Oswald as the assassin of Kennedy, but he believed that Oswald had not acted alone.
Senator Russell seemed to have a little backbone, something that seemed to be sorely lacking these days.
Well, Richard Russell was a man of great integrity and intelligence, and it was obvious to him that the same bullet could not have passed through John Connally and also Jack Kennedy and also hit John Connally. And that was ridiculous. He even had LBJ agreeing with him. And the fact is that what J. Lee Rankin did to Richard Russell by deceiving him was what the commission as a whole was doing to the American people by deceiving them. I think this is a very, very good episode, and that Gerold McKnight handled it well.
Hi, this is Richard Belzer, continuing the great work of Penn Jones and the suspicious deaths.
These are just a few of the names of people who died mysteriously after the assassination. There should be an investigation at this point alone, these suspicious deaths. We have the work of Jim Mars and other early researchers who continued this investigation. This episode, actor, author Richard Belzer gives us his views and research regarding the dead witnesses to the JFK assassination.
This is Richard Belzer. You know, everyone knows that Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas 2 days after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What most don't know is that many other men and women who had some connection to the assassination also died suspicious deaths. Grant Stockdale. He was a former ambassador to Ireland, close friend of the president, fell or was pushed from his office window on the 13th floor of the DuPont building in Midtown Miami. The official verdict, suicide. Actual circumstances, victim's behavior was normal. He came to his office for work on Monday morning, was very pleasant, conversed amiably, did not seem suicidal. Police placed the time of the death at 10:17 a.m. The only other person in the victim's office at that precise moment would have been his killer. No suicide note was found. Apparently, he was mixed up in some very serious political shenanigans. He was a big wheel in the Democratic Party. a person of considerable influence who's also mixed up in the corruption of the Bobby Baker scandal. The official line that Stockdale committed suicide because he was depressed about the murder of his friend JFK seems an incredibly weak supposition. As one author notes, hard-headed businessmen in Stockdale were certainly hard-headed, and his record shows don't kill themselves because a friend has been murdered. Research has established that on November 26th, Stockdale flew to Washington and met with JFK's brothers. On his return, Stockdale told several of his friends that the world was closing in. He talked to his attorney, William Frey, to summarize the conversation as follows. He started talking, didn't make much sense. He said something about those guys trying to get him, then about the assassination. That was the day before he went flying through the window of his 13th floor office. Dorothy Kilgallen was a columnist, the only one to interview Jack Ruby alone. She was a very good reporter. You may remember her from What's My Line, but she was beyond a celebrity. She was a very credible, hard-nosed reporter. And she had talked about blowing the lid off the Kennedy case. In fact, the FBI was harassing her. And she had said that, the FBI would be better served solving the president's murder than harassing me. At any rate, she interviewed Ruby by herself. She told her best friend, her agent, several other people that she was going to blow the lid off the case. She was found dead in a bed in her apartment. Problem is, the bed wasn't her bed. It was a guest room bed. She was dressed in something she never wore to bed. She had all her makeup on. She had a book on her lap that she had already read. Her eyeglasses, reading glasses, were nowhere to be found. They said that she died of a barbiturate and alcohol overdose. Problem was, she had 3 different kinds of barbiturates in her, and she only had access to one, not enough to kill her. She was murdered. A couple of days later, her friend, who she told everything to, was murdered, and several other people that had that knowledge died mysteriously, and all her notes and papers went missing. David Ferry was called to testify by Jim Garrison, was star witness, and he was murdered. And he was working with Dr. Mary Sherman on fast-acting cancers. This gets to be like almost science fiction. She died of multiple stab wounds, penetrating the heart, liver, stomach, labia minora, left arm and right leg, extreme burns of right side of body, complete destruction of right upper extremity and right side of thorax and abdomen, exposing vital organs. Official verdict, unsolved murder. Just to put a button on Dr. Mary Sherman, she was deeply involved in covert research developing a super cancer as a biological weapon. Dr. Sherman also knew both Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry, both of whom were involved in the same research project. George de Mohrenschildt, to me, is one of the most compelling and mysterious characters. Here's a Russian count, a known Nazi who sometimes pretended to be anti-Nazi, was a friend of George Bush Sr. He was an oil engineer, sometimes known as Baron de Mohrenschildt. His cause of death was a shotgun blast deemed suicide. The actual circumstances, George de Mohrenschildt was the key link between Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA, as well as connecting him to extremely conservative Texas oil millionaires rumored to be involved in the JFK assassination. The inconsistencies, well, I'll just break it down for you. Gaetan Fonzi, who was one of the great investigators for the House Select Committee assassinations, wrote the best book on the assassination called The Last Investigation. He was about to interview de Mohrenschildt the next day. De Mohrenschildt was a CIA cutout who was Oswald's handler and had later said that Lee was innocent and didn't do it. Actually wrote a book about that. But he was getting ready to testify, and they say he shot himself with a shotgun. The only problem is his wife was a soap opera fan and had an audio tape recorder going, recording the soap opera because she had to go out. And on that tape, you hear they have an alarm system in their house, and there are 3 levels of the alarm. And there was a middle level, which meant someone had come in, a beep, beep, beep sound, and then you hear footsteps and an explosion. So, he was murdered, clearly, and his wife said, that he was murdered, and she was terrified. I mean, that's how you keep witnesses quiet. You blow their heads off, and everyone around them doesn't talk. Sullivan, high up in the FBI, was shot on his porch, mistaken for a deer. He was talking too much. Sam Giancana was about to testify before the House Select Committee on assassinations. He was under house arrest, was shot in the back and then 5 times around his mouth. just before he was about to testify. Johnny Roselli, who was recruited by William Harvey of the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro, he was shooting off his mouth too. He was called to testify, I believe by Gaetan Fonzi, and he was found chopped into pieces in a barrel floating off the bay in Key Biscayne. That's what they call suicide in New Jersey, but other people have another name for it. The thing that is so fascinating and proves conspiracy is that these people were either getting ready to testify and or they had foreknowledge or were talking after the fact and then died mysteriously.
Hi, Dr. Fetzer. The strange death in and around the assassination is just mind-boggling.
Richard Belzer has published an excellent book, Hit List, that supersedes the earlier work by Craig Roberts and John Armstrong, JFK, The Dead Witnesses, by being more detailed and expository about their deaths. I thought this was an excellent episode, and that his discussions of the death of Dorothy Kilgallen and of George de Morenchild were particularly valuable additions. I think Richard Belzer has made quite a few significant contributions to the case, and this can certainly be counted among them.
We owe a lot to Jim Garrison, and in my opinion, he was a great man. He put everything on the line to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He called the Warren Report a fairy tale and warned us that the media was lying. He was sure JFK was not shot by a lone assassin, and the deeper he looked into the case, the darker it got. Eisenhower warned us of an industrialized military complex. Jim Garrison warned us of the CIA. Opposition to Garrison's investigation did not come from Lee Oswald's relatives. Make a study of where it did come from. It was a coordinated and well-funded attack on the Garrison trial. Author, researcher Jim DiEugenio will elaborate on the struggle that Jim Garrison went through to get to the truth and the facts that led him on the trail of the assassins.
This is Jim DiEugenio, and I am the author of Destiny Betrayed, the second edition, which is subtitled JFK, Cuba, and the Garrison Case. Jim Garrison was elected District Attorney of Orleans Parish in an upset win in 1962. He served for 12 years until 1974. There is little doubt from most objective legal observers that Garrison was probably the best DA that Parish had in the last 60 years. There is also little doubt that by 1966, just before Garrison was going to reopen the Kennedy case, he had one of the most promising careers of any politician in the state of Louisiana, and he very likely could have become either governor or senator. This was all dashed to pieces by his indictment and prosecution of local businessman and CIA agent Clay Shaw. Garrison first investigated the Kennedy assassination on the weekend that it happened. Since Lee Harvey Oswald stayed in New Orleans for 5 months in the summer of 1963, Garrison decided to consult his informant network about who Oswald was in contact with. Assistant DA Herm Coleman took a call from Jack Martin, who had worked in Guy Bannister's office at the time. He told Coleman about Oswald's relationship with one David Ferry, a man who worked for and with the CIA efforts against Castro from before the Bay of Pigs all the way through Operation Mongoose. It later turned out that Oswald knew David Ferry for many years previous because he had served in Ferry's Civil Air Patrol unit as a teenager in 1955. Many witnesses saw Oswald with either Bannister or Ferry in the summer of 1963, and many witnesses saw Oswald in Guy Bannister's office at that time also. Garrison did not know anything about this intriguing background when he brought Ferry in for questioning in November of 1963. He therefore turned him over to the FBI. Ferry lied his head off in his FBI affidavit. For instance, he said he never owned a telescopic rifle, or even used one, or even would know how to use one. The fact that J. Edgar Hoover allowed Ferry to perjure himself and to also obstruct justice reveal that the director had no interest in solving the JFK case. Garrison then reopened his inquiry in November of 1966. He quickly discovered two things about Oswald that startled him. First, that Oswald had taken a Russian test while in the Marines. Second, that on at least one of the flyers that the pro-Castro Oswald was passing out that summer, Oswald had stamped the address 544 Camp Street. Garrison went to this address and discovered it housed the offices of Guy Bannister. This caused him to reassess the portrait of Oswald painted by the Warren Commission. Instead of Oswald as a communist, Garrison now saw him as an agent provocateur, or a double agent. This now ignited his full-blown reinvestigation of the JFK case. In the declassified files of the Assassinations Record Review Board, one of the most arresting discoveries has been that the infiltration of Garrison's office by the CIA began almost as soon as Garrison ordered the Warren Commission volumes. And in fact, Gordon Novell, who was recruited by Allen Dulles to do so, wired Garrison's office for sound and gave some of these tapes to Walter Sheridan, who was preparing a hit piece on the district attorney with the permission of David and Robert Sarnoff, the owners of NBC. Sheridan, of course, then attempted to flip or turn some of Garrison's witnesses, which he was successful at. This and the mysterious death of David Ferry very much hurt Garrison's case. But he then went ahead and indicted Clay Shaw. With Shaw scheduled to go to trial, the efforts to undermine Garrison now were ratcheted up into a higher gear, especially since the DA was now discovering a treasure trove of evidence to substantiate his concept. Kennedy was killed as part of a high-level coup d'etat. For example, the plentiful evidence of Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald in the Clinton-Jackson area, the Rose Cherami incident, which led to the identifications of Sergio Arcacha Smith and Emilio Santana, the identification of Shaw as Clay Bertrand, the man who called Dean Andrews and asked him to go to Dallas to defend Oswald. By late 1967, Richard Helms had ordered the CIA to organize a top-level group inside the agency called the Garrison Group. This included Helms' assistant, Thomas Karamessinis, and James Angleton's top assistant, Ray Roca. Angleton and Roca now began to keep enormous files of information on what Garrison was turning up. And now even more attempts at subterfuge took place through the likes of pseudo-reporter Hugh Ainsworth and CIA agent Bill Boxley. The CIA began to influence out-of-state and sometimes in-state judges not to honor subpoenas to return witnesses. And people like Hugh Ainsworth began to surveil, bribe, and harass potential witnesses like local Sheriff John Manchester in the Clinton-Jackson area. By the time of the trial of Clay Shaw, this effort went up even to a higher gear. Richard Case Nagel, who Garrison once called the most important witness in the case, had a hand grenade thrown at him. Clyde Johnson, who met Clay Shaw and was instructed by Clay Shaw to make inflammatory speeches against Kennedy to bring him down to New Orleans, was beaten to a pulp within a hair's breadth of his life. Aloysius Habekorst, who Shaw revealed that his alias was Clay Bertrand too, was rammed by a truck before he was going to testify. Because of all this extraordinary interference and the real-time monitoring of the actual trial, Shaw was acquitted. It later turned out that, as Garrison suspected, Shaw had committed perjury numerous times by saying that he never worked for the CIA, did not know Ferry, and did not know Oswald.
I did not know Harvey Lee Oswald, nor did I ever see or talk with him or anyone who knew him at any time in my life.
Garrison's attempt to try Shaw on those charges was stopped by a state court, and a very organized effort was made to get him out of the DA's office and replaced by the man who had monitored the trial of Clay Shaw for the Justice Department, a man named Harry Connick. This ended up being very bad for the people of New Orleans because it was successful. Garrison was defeated at the polls by Connick because Connick ended up being one of the worst DAs New Orleans parish has ever had. The idea, of course, was not for the people of New Orleans. It was to make sure that no more indictments would ever come out of New Orleans, but also to make an example out of Jim Garrison, meaning that the message was there. No other DA should ever try and do this, or we will do to you what we did to Jim Garrison. And unfortunately, that message ended up being communicated very well, since no other DA has ever tried anything to reopen the Kennedy case.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, my hero, Jim Garrison, and the only person to bring any legal action whatsoever. So what do you think about Jim Diogenio's work?
This actually is a very, very good segment. Not surprising, since Diogenio has made Garrison the focus of his own research. But he does a very able job of presenting many aspects of this, including the multiple attempts to subvert and undermine Jim Garrison's investigation. The only significant aspect he omits, it seems to me, is that Johnny Carson was used to ridicule him on national television. Even in passing, there's an article is shown. Garrison says Oswald didn't fire at JFK, that he claimed he didn't fire a shot at President Kennedy, which, of course, has been the conclusion of the Oswald Innocence campaign, which I'm fairly confident Diogenio is dismissive with regard to, but in fact we've demonstrated repeatedly that Lee Oswald was captured in the doorway of the famous photograph taken by James Ike Alchin, and I'd be pleased to debate him or anyone else, including Robert Groden, about that matter anytime they're willing to come forward and put up. So this is a very good segment.
Yeah, we've been declined twice already, and I would like the audience to know that I am personal friends with Jim Garrison's wife, Liz, and I just love her to death. She's paid a heavy price for all this, and she's done the best she can. She's no JFK researcher or anything like that. She only took it from a wife's viewpoint. So, all right, let's go on to the House Select Committee and Dan Hardway.
Quoting from an interview with Lyndon Johnson from the Atlantic Monthly magazine of July 1973, during coffee, the talk turned to President Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson expressed his belief that the assassination in Dallas had been part of a conspiracy. He never believed that Oswald acted alone, although he could accept that he pulled the trigger. He said, and Leo Janus wrote, "We had been operating a damn murder incorporated in the Caribbean." In 1976, a House Select Committee was formed and asked to reinvestigate the JFK assassination after the public had completely lost its faith in the Warren Commission and the report. And no wonder when President Lyndon Johnson never believed it. The public was so outraged that it demanded new hearings and investigation, since it had now been revealed CIA had ties to other assassinations and assassination attempts. It's time to hear firsthand of what was learned when the House Select Committee on Assassination released its report in 1978. It's time you hear firsthand from a former Senate investigator. It's time you hear from, in his own words, Dan Hardway.
My name's Dan Hardway, and I am convinced that the Central Intelligence Agency ran at least one, and possibly more than one, disinformation operations against the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I began working on the staff of the committee in July of 1977. I was a law student at Cornell and accompanied Bob Blakey to Washington when he took over as chief counsel. I was assigned to the staff task force that was investigating possible connections between intelligence agencies and Lee Harvey Oswald. When we first arrived, the CIA was totally uncooperative, and there was no agreement to provide access to any agency information. My work was dependent upon gaining access to CIA records. While waiting for negotiations between the committee and the agency to reach some kind of agreement on that issue, my work was largely restricted to review of previously released information and the critics' theories and speculations. I recall one incident that occurred in this period very vividly. I was sent to Jacksonville, Florida with investigator Gaten Fonzie to interview a retired CIA officer. Upon our arrival, we handed him our committee credentials, telling him that we were there to ask him some questions on behalf of Congress. He flipped the credentials back at us and told us, "So you represent Congress. What the F is that to the CIA? You'll be gone in a few years, and the CIA will still be here." That really sums up a lot of the problems that we had. At the beginning, Bob Blakey was skeptical of any CIA involvement in the assassination. He was also aware that his time and budget were very limited and that he was working for a congressional committee, not a prosecutor's office. He emphasized that the product was to be a final report and possibly proposed legislation. I remember many discussions with him early on where I and others pressed for more investigation into possible conspirators. Bob's response was consistent. You have to prove a conspiracy first. We cannot put all of our eggs in one basket and investigate possible conspirators if we can't prove that there was a conspiracy. Bob Blakey did, however, negotiate a very good agreement with the agency that gave us unprecedented access to their files, or at least what we thought was unprecedented access. The deal was that we could see any file we requested so long as we saw it at Langley, and nothing left Langley except what we could carry in our heads. Even our notes stayed there. My primary assignment on Task Force 5 was to research and investigate the CIA's awareness of Lee Harvey Oswald's activities in Mexico City. From the fall of 1977 to midsummer 1978, Eddie Lopez and I had an office at CIA headquarters in Langley. We were able to request access to any file which we could identify. As a result of my research during this period, I became convinced that the agency had obtained photographs of Oswald in Mexico City, or at least of someone claiming to be Oswald. I was also convinced that someone had impersonated him in telephone calls to the Russian embassy, if not in person, at the Russian and Cuban embassies. I had also learned that the Cuban embassy camera surveillance operation was testing an impulse camera that was triggered automatically during the days Oswald was alleged to have been at the embassy. The photographs from this camera were never produced for our review. No one knew what had happened to them. I believed then and still do that the assassination bore the earmarks of an intelligence operation. I thought that a way to get into the operation to try to unravel it was to look at the disinformation portion of the assassination and to work back from that. I identified the sources of the stories that came out immediately after the assassination with detailed information about Oswald and his pro-Castro activities. I started asking for CIA files on the individuals who told those stories, and had seen quite a few files by midsummer, although I never got to see all of them. That is when the CIA changed the procedures on us. They brought George Joanides out of retirement to be the new liaison with me and Ed. He closed our office at Langley. The agency set up a safe room for us to use in the committee offices. I no longer had direct contact with any CIA employees to request files. All further requests for documents or files had to be in writing. Files were not produced for weeks after being requested. My whole inquiry into areas outside and inside the scope of my portfolio pretty much ground to a halt. Before I was shut down, I'd been able to document many links between David Phillips and most of the sources of the stories that came out immediately after the assassination with detailed information on Oswald and his pro-Castro proclivities. I confronted David Phillips with those links in an interview at our offices on August 24th, 1978. He was extremely agitated by that line of questioning, but was forced to admit that many of the sources were not only former assets that he had managed at JM Wave, but were also assets whom he was personally managing in the fall of 1963. And that brings us back to Mr. Joanides and the disinformation operation ran by the CIA against the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They considered my research and requests to be, quote, aggressive harassment. The agency worked hard to discredit me and Ed Lopez in the eyes of our bosses at the committee. For example, on August 18, 1978, Scott Breckenridge, a CIA liaison, met with Gary Cornwall and told him that Ed and I labored under a burden of credibility in the agency and are so callow that we did not want to trust them with the kind of information that they were seeking. When Gary indicated that CIA should tell them what the source of their concern was, Breckenridge replied that it was primarily their attitude and conduct, and I did not feel it constructive to discuss it further, the kind of information we were seeking. While there were a couple other things I wanted at the time, I didn't really learn what the information they were concerned about us getting hold of was until Jeff Morley called me about what he had found in the George Joanides 201 file around 2 decades later. It turns out that Joanides was running the propaganda shop at Jamwave in 1963 and had direct responsibility for the DRE, the main source of pro-Castro Oswald stories before and after the assassination. Jeff filed a lawsuit seeking more information about Joanides and his involvement in anti-Castro Cuban activities in 1963. As part of their response to that lawsuit, the CIA, in a sworn affidavit, acknowledged that George Joannides served in a covert capacity at least twice. Once in the early 1960s in a covert operation codenamed JM Wave or Jam Wave, and as a CIA representative to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The agency did not trust us with the kind of information we were seeking, and they brought someone out of retirement who knew where to not let us look, and he shut us down. In his annual review, his boss at the CIA wrote regarding the firm position Joannides took with the young investigators that if the peculiar nature of the work did not call on Mr. Joannides for all his talents of his wide experience, it nevertheless was his experience and quick perceptions that ensured a superior performance. Indeed, his experience told him what to keep us away from, and our requests, once slowed, allowed him to quickly perceive where we were trying to go. I only regret that we were not able to mount more of a challenge to his talents. Bob Blakey has called what the CIA did obstruction of justice. Ed and I knew what they were doing when they were doing it, and we complained long and hard to our supervisors, including Bob. He has since said, I wrote off the complaints. I was wrong. The researchers were right. Small comfort in light of the fact that it's been 50 years and there is still no truth and no accountability from the agency. I still believe that there was intelligence operational involvement in the assassination. And I still believe that, at the time, a hard look into Bill Harvey and the post-assassination disinformation operation had the best chance of unraveling that involvement. But the opportunity is past, and I fear unrecoverable. Phillips had 3 cigarettes lit at the same time when I pressed him on his assets disinformation campaign. But looking at it like a poker game, I only had a deuce in the hole, and it wasn't wild. The ace that I had been looking for but didn't find was the fact that Joannides had taken over from Phillips at JM Wave, and there was an entire active operation in 1963 with DRE and Oswald. We now know Joannides ran the DRE as their case officer. We may never know if Phillips was still involved in that operation. I remember the day the acoustics report came in and Bob learned that we had evidence of 2 shooters and hence a conspiracy. I can still see it clearly in my memory. He and I were standing in the hallway outside Team 5's office. He said to me, my God, we've proven a conspiracy, but we haven't investigated the conspirators. I told him that we should never have put our eggs into one basket, but that I did have some ideas along those lines based on the research that he had allowed me to do. I volunteered to write a memorandum based upon a motive, means, and opportunity analysis. I wrote the memo in the CIA safe room on sequentially numbered pages with purple border stamped top secret. When I was done, Bob read it in the safe room. I do not know if anyone else outside of the CIA has ever seen it. The Assassinations Record Review Board told me that there is no record of the memo in anything that they were able to find. When the safe room was set up, the agency told the committee that after the final report was written, all working papers, not formal HSA memorandum of interviews, transcripts of hearings, or depositions, or committee documents, will be destroyed. I guess they probably, innocently of course, thought that the memorandum was just a working document. Joannides is dead. Phillips is dead. Harvey is dead. Documents no longer exist. The secrets are safe.
All right, the House Select Committee, Dr. Fetzer and Dan Hallway.
This is another simply excellent segment, Gary. Dan Hallway is very good at discussing a whole range of issues related to the HSCA, whose own investigation, which I believe in many ways was an attempt to impose a more sophisticated cover-up, especially in relation to the medical evidence than had the Warren Commission, was unsuccessful for many reasons, including that Robert Blakey, its director, was preoccupied with pinning the tail on the mafia, which was undoubtedly involved, but which was also a minor player in relation to the the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, Lyndon Johnson, and others. Joanides is a fascinating character, and his records are still being withheld by the CIA in violation of the JFK Records Act, which just is indicative of how important they are. And their stonewalling regarding him seems to me to also be consistent with Jim DiEugenio's observation about Richard Helms having organized a special Garrison committee to undermine and contain the work of the DA of New Orleans. And in this case, the CIA with the HSCA even created a safe room so they could contain and control the passage of information, not allowing any notes to be taken, and all that really was to make it impossible for anything involved in these discussions to have any legal significance. I'd observe that E. Howard Hutt, in his final confessions to his son St. John, observed that the chain of command went from Lyndon Johnson to Cord Meyer to David Atlee Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales, and I have no doubt that woven within this mix was Joanides, and that, Ed Lansdale and so forth were slightly lower echelons in coordinating and supervising the assassination of JFK, which, of course, also involved George Herbert Walker Bush. So this is a very, very good segment, Gary, and I think Len Osanic ought to be quite proud of it.
All right, we're in the final stretch. Are you telling me that the House Select Committee was basically trying to patch up their story?
Yeah, they were trying to make it do a better job of covering up, and especially in relation to the medical evidence, by contracting the wound, which had been a fist-sized wound observed at Parkland, and the physician, Commander Humes, took a cranial saw and enlarged the wound to make it simply enormous, and then they sought to contract it to just a small wound, not even at the vicinity of the external occipital protuberance, but they raised it by 4 inches. It's really embarrassing and blatant when you look at it and compare the descriptions of the wounds. It becomes so obvious that the HSC was attempting to perform a very sophisticated cover-up.
Yeah, leave it to CIA and just screw up worse than the first time.